figured if there's one person that I can afford to cut out today without having a protracted discussion would be myself. But we ended up having enough time. So I'm going to end off our session today just saying a little bit about my own research, and I will encourage Amanda to just throw a water bottle at me if I get too close to time. So I've had the privilege of meeting all of you now, which is fantastic, and I want to say a little bit today, just a little about the research I do, and in the spirit that Jessica presented, trying to capture it under kind of one moniker. I went with the 3 words, advancing environmental stewardship, and cut out the rest of the tagline. Figured, hey, why not? So I really thought the way Marilyn started us off today was interesting to kind of give that historical perspective, and made me really think about how did I start down this road. And it's interesting when you actually look at these images, all of them have water and rivers in them. And so I grew up with a father who was a fanatical fisherman, fly fisherman in particular. And we were either fishing, hunting, or camping almost every weekend for the entire year for my entire childhood until I moved away for university. And then, of course, I went to Lakehead to study outdoor recreation. So this is the stuff I grew up with. And the thing that was really interesting, I guess, through this exercise of thinking through how we came to this program of research is how influential some of those early childhood experiences actually are on shaping what we grow up to be. And so being on the river in those early times, you would see garbage, you would see pollution, there would be fewer fish in the river, there would be individuals that got really mad when canoeists were coming down the river. And I like to always use the example where, you know, anglers are putting structures into the river trying to build habitat for fish, and sometimes canoeists are taking them out because the habitats are blocking their canoe route. So we had conflict and so on. And a lot of this program of research, when it started about 20 years ago, at that time, and I'll take you back 20 years, the real focus was on the pathology of natural resource management, trying to control the environment, trying to use regulations to exert change on human beings. And so instead of trying to do that and recognizing that first generation environmental challenges, so how we control point source pollution, we had some really good success in the 60s and up to the 80s in those regards, but we did much less well when it came to non-point source pollution. How do we control these highly conflicting different behaviors, different perspectives when we involved all kinds of different people? And so as a response to that 20 years ago, and this was cutting edge stuff at the time, much less so today, my PhD research actually focused on how different groups of people can work together to manage rivers. And at the time, that was a really novel concept. And so as a counterpoint to this pathology of in natural resource management, the initial thrust of my research program was really around community-based resource management, and then specifically what types of innovative novel approaches can we use to work together about how we manage as well as govern or make decisions about our natural resources. And so from that jumping off point, that led to co-management. So how do we work together in the non-regulatory sense to manage our resources? And then from there, we've gone to adaptive co-management. So bringing together the collaborative narrative with the adaptive narrative in resource management to get more than the sum of the parts. And what does that look like? And then since then, and Julia alluded nicely in her talk to this, we've tried to take it to the next step, and how do we actually make some of those more fundamental connections? Can we build a relational understanding to start developing some theories around how people actually act? So for ourselves in our advancing environmental stewardship, we've now gone to try to understand, here's an individual, the individual has certain values, certain motivations, certain characteristics. That individual is undertaking particular actions on the landscape as a steward. That individual engages in some type of process, so whether that's adaptive co-management or community-based management, whether that's participatory types of processes, he or she will engage in those processes. They have some kind of influence, that social process. And it's fascinating that Garrett mentioned the power of those processes. And then last but not least, what's the outcome? So what's the effect? What's the result that they actually have? And then what's the feedback to change those people? So in a very real sense, and one of the reasons, and these are images from a past grad student of mine, Katrina Crevens, if you're an individual, you're highly motivated to get out there and do stream restoration, and you meet other people and you start engaging, and then you join your local chapter of Trout Unlimited Canada, and you start going to meetings and you work together on these things and you get really excited about it, and then what are the actual social and ecological changes that we see on the landscape, and how does that feed back into changing your behavior every day? Does it mean you buy organic groceries? Does it mean, as Gary said, you eat less red meat? Do you change your behaviors? So at a very large scale, those are the big picture items that we look at. In terms of a second thing that we do, we then drill down in each of those areas and try to unpack them. So some of the specific variables that we've looked at within those processes, for example, things like social capital, so the ideas of trust, reciprocity, and networks in those social processes. Social learning, so that whole adaptive piece that we now think of. And so this whole research program is grounded in the Anthropocene and these ideas, complexity, uncertainty, and change. We need to be reflective. We need to concern ourselves with adaptive capacity. And then also the piece around monitoring and evaluation. Critically important, typically not done in environment and resource management. And if it is done, it's not done in a way that's consistent with the Anthropocene. So how do we devise meaningful ways that are transparent and have good accountability for monitoring and evaluation? And then the last thing that I'll mention that our research team does a lot of work in is both the theoretical side of things as also very applied work. So from a theoretical standpoint, on one hand, we don't really care about the context. So we're looking at a social process, we're looking at a relational understanding of these elements, and whether that happens in a biosphere reserve in Canada or Sweden, whether that happens in a river in Ontario or a watershed in British Columbia or the Barents region in the Arctic Circle or in small-scale fisheries in Uruguay, we've worked in all those contexts. The common denominator is the phenomena or the relationship that we're building to understand theoretically. The other piece that we do a lot of work in is in the applied side, and there we really concentrated on water resource management in the Canadian context. And so we've taken a lot of these conceptual things that we look at and we say, how are these playing themselves out on the ground in Canada in terms of water? So Julia used a lot of examples about water resilience. We've looked at water resilience in various provinces across Canada. What does it actually mean? How are watershed organizations actually enacting that? We've done the same with flooding, source water protection, cisterns, watershed management, watershed planning. So a lot of our applied work is actually around the context of water. And that obviously had early roots and has stuck, and we're still consistent with that today. So just a little bit, and I got the 2-minute warning, so that was timed well. Just a little bit about my own work also. And I'm happy to answer any questions for exactly 1 minute that I have left. Okay, great. Thank you. I want to just end today by thanking you all. I know it's been